The clock on the cabin wall read 6:45 in the morning when Marcus Rivera got up from bed for the fourth time that night. Another nightmare, always the same one. The explosion of the IED, the screams of his comrades, the smell of gunpowder and blood in the dusty streets of Kandahar. 42 years old, veteran of 3 tours in Afghanistan with the Army Rangers, and still the ghosts of the past gave him no peace. Marcus walked to the fogged window of his cabin in the frozen mountains of Montana, adjusting the faded military cap he rarely took off his head. The property inherited from his grandfather stretched over 50 acres of rugged land, covered by century-old pine trees and fields where morning frost created a crystalline carpet that sparkled under the first rays of sun. He had been living there for almost 2 years, isolated from the world, surviving on the meager military pension that barely covered basic expenses. The wooden cabin was simple: 2 small bedrooms, a taïdia kitchen that also served as a living room, and a bathroom with plumbing that worked when it wanted to. The roof needed repairs, the windows didn't close properly, and the wood-burning heater consumed more firewood than it could produce heat. But it was his refuge, the only place where he could exist without having to explain his scars or justify his silence. It was when he was preparing to light the first cigarette of the day that Marcus noticed the familiar presence on the other side of the barbed wire fence. For 15 consecutive days, always at the same time, 7 o'clock sharp in the morning, the same stray dog appeared on the trail in front of his property. It was a medium-sized mixed breed, brown and black coat with some white patches on the chest and paws, upright ears, thick tail, erect posture that vaguely resembled a German shepherd mixed with some smaller breed. The animal always positioned itself in the same place, on the other side of the fence, and looked directly at Marcus through the window with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. It wasn't the desperate look of an abandoned animal searching for food. It wasn't the submissive posture of someone asking for help. It was something different, almost evaluative, as if the dog was studying Marcus, weighing something in its canine mind. It remained there for exactly 10 minutes, then disappeared into the woods, always by the same trail that wound between the pine trees. Marcus never approached. He didn't offer food, didn't try to make contact. He didn't want bonds, not anymore. He had learned the hard way that getting attached to something or someone only made the loss more painful. In Afghanistan, he had made the mistake of getting too close to his platoon mates. When Sergeant Rodriguez died in his arms, hit by grenade shrapnel, Marcus swore never again to allow someone to become important enough that their death would be devastating. But this June morning, with frost still crystallized, in the fields and the mountain wind cutting through skin like a razor blade, the dog didn't appear. Marcus prepared his usual black coffee, lit his cigarette, and tried to ignore the strange feeling that bothered him. 7:15, 7:20, 7:30. Nothing, just the empty field and the sound of wind swaying the tree branches. Strange how the absence of something that shouldn't matter could generate so much discomfort. Marcus had developed over 15 years of military career, a sharp instinct for abnormal situations. It was a sixth sense that had kept him alive when IEDs exploded out of nowhere in Kandahar, when snipers hid on the rooftops of Afghan villages, when tension in the air indicated that something was about to go wrong, and today that instinct was screaming. At 8 in the morning, Marcus gave up trying to follow his normal routine. He should have been fixing the back shed, where he kept the few tools and the chainsaw he used to cut firewood. He should have been checking the rabbit traps he had set the previous week, or cleaning the clogged gutter that made rain run down the kitchen wall. Instead, he found himself walking toward the trail the dog usually used. He didn't admit to himself that he was looking for the animal. He told himself he was just exploring a part of the property he knew little about, or that he was curious about the boundaries of the land inherited from his grandfather. But his steps automatically led him through the dense woods, following tracks that only his eyes trained in military tracking could distinguish in the wet and frozen ground. The trail wound for about 2 miles, descending the rocky slope between native pines and bamboo clumps that created a natural corridor. Marcus noticed signs that this path was used regularly. Branches broken at the right height for a medium-sized dog, small paw prints in dried mud, even some brown fur stuck to bush thorns. The path led him to a wider valley where the remains of an old ranch still resisted time and abandonment. Marcus knew the place by reputation. It was property of the Millers, a traditional family in the region who had abandoned everything after the last patriarch died 3 years ago and the heirs moved to Denver. The main house was a robust construction of stone and wood, typical of early 20th century rural American architecture. Thick walls, small windows, clay roof that had lost several tiles over years of abandonment. A large barn for equipment stood beside it, with wooden doors swaying in the wind. Further ahead, the remains of corrals and pens where cattle had grazed decades before. It was when he was approaching the main house that Marcus heard the sound. A low moan, almost imperceptible, coming from behind the rubble of what had once been a small annex to the main construction. Marcus approached with military caution that had become second nature, each step calculated to make no noise on the ground covered with dry leaves. He controlled his breathing, sharpened his senses, mentally prepared for any situation. What he found made his stomach contract and something tighten in his chest. The dog, his dog, as he already thought without admitting it, was trapped under a thick beam of rotten wood that had collapsed, probably during the early morning when the mountain wind blew stronger than normal. The right hind leg was clearly fractured, bent at an angle that wasn't natural. The animal was panting with difficulty, forming small vapor clouds in the cold morning air. But what impressed Marcus most was the expression in the animal's eyes. There was no desperation there, no blind panic that wounded animals usually demonstrate. Instead, there was a dignified resignation, almost human, like that of a wounded soldier who knows he's in bad shape but maintains composure, waiting for rescue. The dog saw him approach and made an effort to lift its head, but didn't whimper, didn't make any sound of supplication. It just looked at Marcus with that same evaluative intensity of the last 15 days, as if saying, "Well, now we'll see what kind of man you really are." "Easy, buddy," Marcus murmured, kneeling beside the animal on the cold ground. "Let's get you out of there." The beam was heavier than it looked, but Marcus still maintained the strength from his active service days. Years of intense physical training and heavy work had built muscles that the sedentary life of the last 2 years had softened but not completely eliminated. Carefully, he positioned himself at the best angle and lifted the rotten wood enough for the dog to crawl out. The animal tried to stand immediately, but the injured leg couldn't support the weight, and it lay back down on the ground, panting more intensely. Marcus examined it with the same meticulousness he had used to evaluate wounded comrades in combat, applying basic first aid knowledge that all soldiers learn. "Simple fracture, from what I can see," he said in a low voice, more to himself than to the dog. "Doesn't look like it hit a main artery. You were lucky, buddy." He removed the olive-green military jacket he always wore and wrapped the animal carefully, creating a kind of improvised stretcher. The dog didn't resist. On the contrary, it seemed to relax for the first time since Marcus had found it, resting its head on the man's chest, as if it instinctively knew it was finally safe. During the walk back, which lasted almost an hour due to the weight and the need to move slowly to not aggravate the animal's injuries, Marcus noticed something that deeply intrigued him. The dog showed no fear, didn't tremble, didn't whimper. There was absolute confidence in its eyes, as if it had known Marcus for years, instead of just observing him from a distance for 2 weeks. It was as if the animal was certain it would be saved, that Marcus was exactly the right person to find it in that situation. There was something almost planned about that whole situation, although Marcus couldn't imagine how a dog could orchestrate its own rescue. Back at the cabin, Marcus carried the animal inside and installed it on an old blanket near the wood-burning heater. He improvised a splint using wood strips from a toolbox and cloth strips from an old shirt, applying the first aid knowledge he had learned in the army and had used a few too many times in real combat situations. The dog remained completely still during the entire procedure, occasionally licking Marcus's hand in gratitude, but without showing excessive pain or trying to bite in defensive reflex. It was an impressive level of trust and self-control for a supposedly wild animal. "You need a name," Marcus murmured while offering water in an old bowl. "How about Ranger? You have military discipline, buddy. More discipline than many soldiers I've known." The dog moved its tail weakly, as if approving the choice, and Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. The satisfaction of having done something good for another living being, without ulterior motives, without expecting reward. In the following days, an unexpected routine was established in the isolated cabin. Marcus prepared food for two, sharing his simple meals of rice, beans, and canned meat with his new companion. He talked to Ranger during meals, speaking about the weather, about necessary repairs to the property, about less painful memories from his military service time. He discovered that having company relieved the weight of silence he had carried since leaving the army. For 2 years, he had lived immersed in his own thoughts, ruminating guilt and regrets, reliving traumatic moments he couldn't process alone. Now, with Ranger by his side, he felt less pressured to fill the mental void with self-destructive obsessions. The dog recovered quickly, but remained close to Marcus even after the splint was removed and he returned to walking normally. It was as if he had finally found his place in the world, or as if he had fulfilled some personal mission by locating exactly the right person to care for him. Marcus noticed that Ranger possessed intelligence out of the ordinary. The animal quickly learned the house routine, anticipated the owner's needs, alerted about weather changes long before Marcus noticed the signs. When it was about to rain, Ranger became restless and directed Marcus to collect the firewood that was drying outside. When there was strange movement around the property, the dog emitted a specific low growl that Marcus learned to interpret as a discreet warning. But it was on the 4th morning after the rescue that Ranger demonstrated the first real sign of his exceptional intelligence. Marcus was preparing his morning coffee when the dog began barking insistently toward the back window. It wasn't an alarm bark, nor the sound dogs make when they want to go out to relieve themselves. It was something more specific, more directed, as if trying to draw attention to something very particular that Marcus wasn't seeing. "What is it, Ranger?" Marcus asked, looking through the window in the direction indicated by the animal. "There's nothing there," but Ranger continued barking, now walking to the door and looking at Marcus with an expression that clearly said, "Follow me. It's important." The dog even picked up the improvised leash that Marcus had made with rope and brought it in his mouth, making it clear he wanted to go out, specifically with his owner. Against his skeptical nature and his tendency toward isolation, Marcus grabbed his coat and followed the dog through the back of the property. Ranger no longer limped, moving with determination and purpose, stopping occasionally to ensure Marcus was following and hadn't gotten distracted with other things. The route led them to an area where Marcus rarely went, a section of the property covered by tall grass and some old fruit trees near the boundary of the 50 acres inherited from his grandfather. It was a region that had always seemed insignificant, just another piece of field without specific use. Ranger stopped in front of a small hill covered with dense vegetation and began digging with his front paws, completely ignoring the leg that had been injured just days before. The animal dug with determination, as if he knew exactly what he was looking for and where to find it. "Hey, you're gonna hurt yourself again," Marcus said, crouching down to move the dog away from the spot. "Easy, buddy." But when he touched the ground where Ranger was digging, Marcus felt something strange under his fingers. The earth was too loose, different from the compact soil of the rest of the property. It was as if it had been recently disturbed, then covered again to disguise it. Marcus returned to the cabin, got a shovel from the small tool shed, and returned to the spot. He began digging methodically, removing layers of earth carefully to not damage whatever was buried there. Ranger sat beside him, watching the process with the patience of one who knows the objective will be achieved. 12 inches below the surface, the shovel blade hit something solid, metal. Marcus cleared more earth around it and exposed a small metal box, approximately the size of a shoebox, clearly buried there relatively recently. The box wasn't rusted, indicating it had been buried recently and adequately protected against moisture. Marcus removed it from the hole and carried it back to the cabin, with Ranger trotting alongside, clearly satisfied with the mission's success. Inside the cabin, Marcus opened the box carefully. The contents were wrapped in resistant plastic and electrical tape, professionally protected against moisture and deterioration. There were official documents, old photographs, various certificates, and a small leather pouch that weighed more than it appeared. Marcus examined the papers with growing surprise and unease. They were property documents, birth and death certificates, genealogical records, and several old photographs of the Miller family, the former owners of the abandoned ranch where he had found Ranger injured. The photographs showed 3 generations of the family. Patriarch James Miller, still young, posing proudly in front of the stone house, his children at various ages, playing in fields that were now abandoned, grandchildren Marcus didn't recognize, but who had clearly grown up and moved away from rural life. But the most intriguing item was in the leather pouch. Inside, Marcus found a hand-drawn map on resistant paper, showing the region in impressive detail, with specific markings made in pencil and annotations in cursive handwriting. Along with the map was a handwritten note on yellowed paper. For my grandchildren, in case I can't personally tell them where the family's true treasure is hidden. The land is worth more than gold for those who know how to care for it, but I left some savings buried for whoever is worthy of finding them. If you're reading this, follow the map's clues and trust Ranger. He knows everything. James Miller, December 2019. Marcus felt his heart accelerate as he reread the letter. James Miller had been the last resident of the abandoned ranch, a man known in the region for his eccentricity, distrust of banks, and almost obsessive attachment to land inherited from his ancestors. There were rumors that he kept his savings at home, hidden in places only he knew. But when he died 3 years ago, nothing had been found by the heirs. James's children and grandchildren had sold the property to an agribusiness company from Chicago for a symbolic value and never returned to the region. The land had been left abandoned, waiting for the company to decide what to do with it, whether it would be turned into soybean plantation, cattle pasture, or simply kept as speculative investment. Marcus looked at Ranger, who was watching him with that intelligent expression he already knew well. The dog had positioned himself beside the table where the documents were spread, as if supervising the discovery and awaiting Marcus's next decision. "You knew old James, didn't you?" Marcus asked the animal, who responded with a small confirming bark. "That's why you kept looking at my house every day. You were evaluating me, deciding if I would be the right person for this." Ranger tilted his head to the side in an almost human expression of agreement. Marcus studied the map with military attention. James Miller had marked 3 specific points on the old property, each identified with different symbols: a tree, a stone, and a star. There were annotations about natural landmarks, giant steps, and where the eagle rests. It was clearly a code, a language that made sense only to someone who intimately knew that land. The first clue led to where grandfather planted the seed of the future, 40 paces from the main gate. Marcus presumed it referred to some significant tree on the Miller property. The second clue spoke about the stone that marks the center of the world, where paths cross. The third, more enigmatic, said, where the eagle rests and the sun rises twice. During the rest of the day, Marcus couldn't concentrate on any other task. His military mind, trained to solve complex problems under pressure, was completely absorbed by the mystery left by James Miller. There was something deeply intriguing about the idea of a man who had spent the last years of his life creating a kind of treasure hunt to ensure his savings reached the right hands. And Ranger, apparently, was the key to everything. The next morning, Marcus decided to follow the clues. He prepared a backpack with water, some basic tools, and James Miller's map. Ranger seemed to immediately understand what was happening, positioning himself beside the door with an animation he hadn't shown since recovering from his injuries. The first destination was the old Miller property. Marcus already knew the way, but now observed everything with different eyes, looking for the natural landmarks mentioned in the map. Ranger guided him confidently, clearly familiar with every trail, every stone, every tree in the region. The main gate mentioned in the first clue still existed, though it was in poor condition. It was a wrought iron structure, rusted by time, with stone pillars beginning to lean. Marcus counted 40 paces from the gate. Following the direction that seemed most logical, the steps led him to a century-old oak tree, much older than the other trees in the region. The trunk was immense, more than 6 feet in diameter, and the canopy extended like a giant umbrella over an area of several yards. Marcus examined the base of the tree and found what he was looking for: initials carved in the bark, already partially healed by wood growth. JM 1,987 inches was carved on the south side of the trunk, along with a small symbol that corresponded to the first landmark on James Miller's map. Marcus began digging at the base of the tree. Oriented by the carved symbol, Ranger positioned himself beside him, watching attentively, occasionally barking encouragingly when Marcus seemed to be digging in the right direction. The second box was buried a little deeper than the first, about 20 inches below the surface. It was the same type, resistant metal, well sealed against moisture. Inside, Marcus found not only money, about $50,000 in hundreds and fifties, carefully stored in plastic bags, but also a new map, more detailed than the first. And another letter from James Miller. "Congratulations on getting this far, unknown friend. If you're reading this letter, it means Ranger chose you, and I trust his judgment more than any person I've known. You're proving to be exactly the kind of person I can trust with my family's secrets. This money is just the beginning. It's what I saved selling some cattle heads in recent years, money I didn't want to leave in the bank for my children to waste on nonsense in the big city. But the real treasure is yet to come. You'll have to prove you're worthy of it. The next map is more complicated. The clues will require not only intelligence, but also courage and persistence. And pay close attention to Ranger. He knows all the secrets of this land. He can see things you can't see, find paths you don't know. Just one warning: not every treasure is gold and silver. Sometimes what seems most valuable isn't what really matters. Keep an open mind and an honest heart. Good luck on the next stage. James Miller. Marcus reread the letter several times, trying to decipher between the lines. There was something deeply personal in those words, as if James Miller was speaking directly to him through time. And the specific mention of Ranger confirmed his suspicions. The dog wasn't just a random animal who had found him by chance. The second map was considerably more complex than the first. It showed not only the Miller property, but the entire surrounding region, including Marcus's property. There were detailed markings about land elevations, watercourses, rock formations, and even some constructions Marcus didn't recognize. The second clue led to the stone that marks the center of the world, where paths cross. Marcus studied the map and identified a point where several trails converged, marked with a small circle and a stone symbol. The hike to the second point took almost 2 hours, crossing rough terrain and dense forest. Ranger knew the way perfectly, anticipating difficulties and guiding Marcus through the safest routes. The dog had clearly made that journey many times before, probably accompanying James Miller during the treasure's creation. The stone that marks the center of the world turned out to be an impressive rock formation, a granite outcrop that rose about 10 feet above the surrounding ground, positioned exactly in the center of a natural clearing where 4 old trails met. Marcus climbed the stone and examined the surface. At the highest point, he found another carving, JM, Center 2018. But this time, there was also an arrow pointing down and a number, 15. 15 paces from the base of the stone, in the direction indicated by the arrow, Marcus found the third hiding place. This box was slightly larger than the previous ones and considerably heavier. Inside, besides more money, this time almost $100,000, there were personal objects that clearly had sentimental value, an old military medal, family photographs in silver frames, a pocket watch that still worked, and genealogical documents that traced the Miller family back to the first Portuguese immigrants to the region. But the most significant item was a thick, leather-bound notebook filled with handwritten notes in careful script. Marcus leafed through it quickly and realized it was a kind of diary, with entries dating back more than 20 years. The first page had a dedication: "For whoever comes after me and knows how to value what really matters. James Miller, 1998. The following pages contain not only James's personal reflections about rural life, but also detailed information about agriculture, animal husbandry, water resources in the region, and even maps of springs and underground water veins that Marcus didn't know existed. It was clear that James Miller wasn't just an ordinary rancher. He was a cultured, observant man who had dedicated decades to the systematic study of that land. The diary revealed deep knowledge about geology, meteorology, botany, and sustainable management that could have significant economic value. But James's third letter was what most impacted Marcus. "My young successor, if you've gotten this far, you've already proven to have 3 essential qualities: intelligence to solve problems, persistence to not give up in the face of difficulties, and humility to trust in the wisdom of a dog. These are the only qualities that really matter in life. The money you've found so far, about $150,000, should be sufficient to solve immediate problems and give a fresh start to any sensible person. But that's not the real treasure I want to leave. The real treasure is in the third and final clue. But be careful, it's the most dangerous of all. Not because it involves physical danger, but because it can completely change your life. If you decide to go forward, there's no turning back. You'll become the guardian of something much greater than money. The last clue is where the eagle rests and the sun rises twice. Ranger knows where it is. Let him guide you, but prepare yourself for a choice that will define the rest of your life. One last thing, when you find what I'm leaving, remember that some responsibilities cannot be abandoned. If you accept what I offer, you'll be assuming a commitment that will last. Until the end of your days, think carefully, consult your heart, and if you decide to proceed, may God bless you. James Miller. Marcus closed the notebook and looked at Ranger, who was watching him with that serious and intelligent expression. There was something almost solemn in the air, as if both understood they were reaching the crucial moment of that entire journey. "Where the eagle rests and the sun rises twice," Marcus repeated aloud. "You know where that is, don't you, buddy?" Ranger immediately stood up and walked a few steps toward a trail Marcus hadn't yet explored. The dog stopped, looked back to ensure he had Marcus's attention, and barked once, a sound that clearly meant, "Let's go." Marcus collected all the found items, put them in the backpack along with the money, and followed Ranger down the unknown trail. This time the walk was longer and more difficult than the previous ones. The terrain became progressively steeper, leading them to altitudes where the air was thinner and vegetation changed characteristics. After almost 3 hours of hiking, they reached the highest point in the region, a rocky peak that offered a panoramic view of the entire valley. Marcus had never been there before, didn't even know that point existed within the limits of local properties. At the top, they found a rock formation that immediately explained James Miller's reference. There was an old eagle's nest at the highest point of the rock, abandoned for years, but still clearly recognizable. And the rock was positioned in such a way that during sunset, it created two distinct shadows, one projected eastward by direct light and another westward by reflection on the polished surface of part of the formation. It was literally a place where the eagle rests and the sun rises twice. Ranger went directly to the base of the rock formation and began digging at a specific point. Marcus helped him and soon discovered he wasn't digging ordinary earth. There was a small natural cave at the base of the rock, carefully disguised with stones and vegetation. Inside the cave, Marcus found James Miller's final treasure. It wasn't a box this time, but a carved wooden chest, clearly very old and of great artistic value. The chest was in perfect condition, protected from moisture by the natural cave and by an ingenious ventilation system that James had created using PVC pipes disguised among the rocks. Marcus opened the chest with trembling hands. The interior was divided into several compartments, each containing different types of items. There was more money, much more money, at least $300,000 in high-denomination bills. There were antique jewelry, clearly family heirlooms that had passed through several generations. There were historical documents, including the original deed to the Miller property, dated 1892. But in the central compartment of the chest, Marcus found something that made him stop breathing for a moment. It was a sealed envelope, heavy, with his name written on the front for Marcus Rivera. With trembling hands, Marcus opened the envelope and removed an official legal document, notarized, dated only 6 months before James Miller's death. It was a property transfer deed, officially transferring ownership of the entire Miller Ranch, 500 acres of land with house, barns, water springs, and all movable property, to whoever manages to complete the treasure hunt, demonstrating being worthy of caring for the land my ancestors loved. The document was signed and notarized with a specific clause that invalidated any subsequent sale made by the heirs, since they had no knowledge of the existence of this conditional transfer. James Miller's final letter was attached to the document. Marcus Rivera, if you're reading this, it's because Ranger fulfilled his mission and found exactly the person I expected. Yes, I know your name. I know you're a war veteran. I know you came to this region looking for peace and isolation, and I know you have exactly the qualities I need in a successor. How do I know all this? Simple. I spent the last 3 years of my life researching who lived in the region, discreetly talking to people in town, making small investigations about new residents. When you moved to your grandfather's property, I knew I had found my successor, a man with military training, accustomed to discipline and hard work, someone who chose isolation not out of laziness, but out of need for healing, someone who understands the value of land and simplicity, someone who doesn't have his own family to inherit, but has the heart of one who can care for a heritage greater than blood. Ranger was my companion for 8 years. I trained him not only to obey me, but to evaluate people's character. For 2 years, he observed you from a distance, studying your routines, your behavior, your way of treating animals that occasionally appeared on your property. He reported everything. To me, yes, in his canine way, but I understand his language better than that of many humans. When I decided you were the chosen one, I trained Ranger to execute the plan you just experienced. The accident with the beam wasn't an accident. It was very well executed canine theater. Ranger knew exactly how to position himself to appear injured without really hurting himself. The leg fracture was real, but was caused purposefully in a safe place and time, where I knew you would find him. And quickly. All this may seem like cruel manipulation, but it was necessary. I needed to be absolutely certain that you would do the right thing even when there was nothing to gain from it. A man who saves an injured dog without expecting reward is a man who can be trusted with a much greater treasure. This property has 500 acres of good land, 3 permanent clean water springs, and potential for sustainable agriculture that can generate sufficient income for a dignified life. The documents in the chest include soil studies, water resource maps, and development projects I developed over decades. But more important than the land is the responsibility that comes with it. You will become the guardian of a piece of the world that still maintains the purity our grandfathers knew. It will be your obligation to protect the springs, preserve the native forests, and keep alive the tradition of agriculture that respects nature instead of destroying it. The money you found should be sufficient to pay off any debts you have, renovate the property's structures, and invest in basic agricultural equipment. But the real value isn't in gold. It's in the opportunity to start over, to build something lasting, to find the kind of peace that only the land can offer. My children sold this land because they only saw work and isolation. You, I imagine, see possibilities. You see the potential to create something new, to live simply but with dignity, away from the complications and hypocrisies of the modern world. If you accept this inheritance, you won't just be gaining a property, you'll be assuming a mission. The mission to prove that it's still possible to live in harmony with nature, that there are still men capable of valuing simplicity over consumerism, authenticity over appearances. Take good care of Ranger. He knows every secret of this land, every trail, every spring. He will be your guide and your most loyal companion. Take good care of the land. It will take care of you in return. And if one day you feel you're no longer the right guardian, pass it forward the same way I'm doing now. Find someone worthy, test their character, and hand over the responsibility only when you have absolute certainty. Welcome to your true home, Marcus Rivera. May you find here the peace you deserve. James Miller, last guardian of Miller Ranch, first to trust you to continue the legacy. Marcus had to sit on the cold rock to process what he had just discovered. In a few hours, he had gone from an isolated veteran surviving on a small pension to owner of 500 acres of productive land and an amount of money that represented financial security for years to come. But more than that, he had discovered that his entire life of recent months had been carefully observed and evaluated by a man he had never met personally. James Miller had created an elaborate test, not just to find a successor, but to ensure that successor had the right qualities to care for the heritage he was leaving. And Ranger, his faithful companion Ranger, had been the instrument of that entire process. The dog had spent 2 years studying Marcus, somehow reporting in canine fashion to James Miller, and finally executing a sophisticated plan to initiate the process that led to this discovery. Marcus looked at Ranger, who was sitting beside the cave, watching him with that intelligent and patient expression. There was something almost human in the animal's eyes, as if he perfectly understood the magnitude of what had just happened. "You planned all this from the first day, didn't you?" Marcus asked the dog. "You and old James." Ranger barked once and wagged his tail, as if he was finally relieved to be able to abandon the farce and just be the loyal companion he had always been by nature. Marcus spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the surroundings of the rocky peak, processing the discovery and trying to understand the implications of what James Miller had offered him. The view from above showed the extension of the property that now belonged to him. Rolling fields, preserved forests, a small lake he didn't know existed, and the stone house that was now his by legal right. It was much more than he had ever dreamed of owning, but also much more responsibility than he was prepared to assume. During years of military service, Marcus had gotten used to receiving orders, following commands, executing missions defined by others. Now, for the first time, in adult life, he was completely free to make his own decisions about the future. When the sun began to set, creating the double sunrise effect that gave that place its name, Marcus made his decision. "All right, Ranger," he said to the dog, who approached and rested his head on his leg. "Let's accept your old owner's proposal, but you're going to have to teach me everything you know about this land." Ranger barked happily, as if he knew his long mission was finally complete. The descent from the rocky peak was easier than the ascent, but Marcus made it in contemplative silence, carrying the chest with the treasure and processing the profound changes his life was about to undergo. Ranger walked beside him, occasionally looking at Marcus as if wanting to make sure he was okay. Back at his cabin, which now seemed too small for the new reality, Marcus spread all the documents on the kitchen table and began studying them methodically. There were detailed maps of the property, soil, analyses done by agricultural technicians, studies on water resources, and even architectural projects for expansion and improvement of existing structures. James Miller had spent decades planning not only how to preserve his property, but how to develop it sustainably. There were plans for organic agriculture, extensive animal husbandry systems, solar and wind energy utilization, and even rural tourism projects that could generate additional income. It was clear that the old rancher had thought of everything, creating not just an inheritance, but a complete roadmap for whoever came after him. Marcus spent the night studying the documents, drinking coffee, and talking to Ranger about the plans that were beginning to form in his mind. The dog seemed to perfectly understand the conversation, occasionally barking at specific points as if agreeing or disagreeing with the ideas presented. The next morning, Marcus made the first practical decision: move to the ranch's main house. His cabin would remain as a kind of secondary refuge, but the center of operations would be the robust stone and wood construction that James Miller had kept in good condition until the end of his life. The move took 3 days, during which Marcus explored every corner of his new property, accompanied by Ranger. The dog knew every trail, every spring, every significant tree. There were places where James kept tools, specific points where certain medicinal plants grew naturally, and even small shelters, built at strategic points for use during rains or storms. It was as if James Miller had created a living manual of the property in the form of Ranger, a guide who knew all the practical secrets of how to live on that land. Marcus discovered that the property had much greater economic potential than he had initially imagined. There was an orchard of native fruits that, with some care, could produce for local sale. There were fields suitable for planting organic grains with growing market demand. And there was enough space for raising animals in a system that respected animal welfare and produced superior quality meat. But more important than economic potential was therapeutic potential. Working the land, caring for plants and animals, living at a natural pace away from the pressures and complications of urban life. All this was helping Marcus process traumas he had carried for years. The nightmares began to become less frequent. Anxiety attacks practically disappeared. The constant feeling of alertness he had carried since Afghanistan was being replaced by a calmer vigilance, more focused on positive possibilities than invisible threats. Ranger continued being the perfect companion during this entire adaptation process. The dog seemed to instinctively understand when Marcus needed company and when he needed solitude, when he was ready to learn something new and when he needed time to assimilate what he had already learned. 3 months after discovering the treasure, Marcus received his first official visit. It was a lawyer from Denver representing James Miller's heirs, questioning the legitimacy of the property transfer. Marcus received the man in the living room of the main house, with all documents organized and Ranger lying quietly beside the armchair. The lawyer, a 50-year-old man, expensive suit and arrogant attitude, clearly expected to intimidate a simple rural veteran. "Mr. Rivera," the lawyer began, "my clients question the validity of this supposed property transfer." James Miller was clearly in compromised mental state in the last years of his life, and this treasure hunt seems more like an old man's fantasy than a valid legal document. Marcus maintained calm, applying the military discipline he had learned to deal with tense situations. All documents are in order, notarized and properly registered. James Miller was mentally competent until the end of his life, as can be confirmed by the doctor who accompanied him and the notary, who recognized his signature. That may be, the lawyer insisted, but the way this property was transferred is at minimum irregular. My clients are prepared to legally contest. That's when Ranger stood up and walked to the lawyer, stopping in front of him and looking directly into his eyes. There was no threat in the dog's posture, just an intensity that made the man immediately fall silent. Ranger knew James Miller for 8 years, Marcus said calmly. If there's anyone who can attest to the mental sanity and clear intention of the deceased, it's the companion who was by his side every day until the end. The lawyer tried to maintain composure, but it was obvious that Ranger's presence made him uncomfortable. Well, that has no legal value. It has moral value, Marcus interrupted him, and James Miller made it very clear in his letters that he was testing not only competence but character. Your clients had 3 years to discover what their father had left. They failed the test. The conversation extended for another hour, but the result was already defined from the beginning. James Miller's documents were legally impeccable, prepared by competent lawyers, and registered in official notary offices. The heirs had no legal basis to contest the transfer. When the lawyer finally left, Marcus sat on the porch with Ranger and reflected on the difference between legal right and moral right. James Miller had structured his inheritance so that only someone willing to invest time, effort, and genuine concern for the land could find it. James's children and grandchildren had sold the property quickly, without bothering to properly search for the savings they knew existed. They had seen the land only as a financial asset to be liquidated, not as a family inheritance to be preserved. Marcus, on the other hand, had saved an injured dog without expecting reward, had invested time and energy to follow complex clues, had demonstrated the kind of patience and dedication that James Miller was looking for in a successor. Your old owner knew what he was doing, Marcus said to Ranger, scratching behind the dog's ears. He wanted to ensure the land went to someone who valued it for what it really is. Ranger responded with a soft, confirming bark. The following months were of intense but gratifying work. Marcus used part of the found money to modernize the property's infrastructure: new electrical system, adequate plumbing, basic agricultural machinery. He hired some local workers to help with larger projects, creating jobs in the region and establishing positive relationships with the community. The native fruit orchard was restored and expanded. Marcus planted an organic garden that quickly began producing for his own consumption and local sale. He started raising free-range chickens and some cattle in an extensive system, following the guidelines left by James Miller about sustainable management. Ranger proved to be an invaluable partner in all these activities. The dog had been trained by James Miller to assist in rural work. He knew how to guide cattle, alert about climate changes, find injured or lost animals, and even help locate underground springs. It was like having a specialized consultant who intimately knew every aspect of that land. Marcus also discovered that James Miller had kept meticulous records about climate, production, and environmental conditions over decades. These records became a precious guide for planning agricultural activities, anticipating climate problems, and optimizing the use of available natural resources. 1 year after discovering the treasure, Miller Rivera Ranch was producing certified organic foods that were sold directly to restaurants in Denver and conscious consumers from the metropolitan region. The generated income was sufficient not only for maintenance and expansion of activities, but for a comfortable and secure life. But the most important thing wasn't financial success, it was the sense of purpose and peace that Marcus had found. Working the land, direct contact with plants and animals, the natural rhythm of seasons, All this was healing psychological wounds that no medical treatment had been able to reach. The nightmares from Afghanistan almost completely disappeared. Anxiety crises became rare and controllable. The constant feeling of alertness was replaced by healthy vigilance, focused on caring and protecting instead of just surviving. And Ranger continued, being not just a companion, but a true partner in all achievements. The dog had aged gracefully, maintaining the intelligence and loyalty that had always characterized him, but now with the wisdom of one who had successfully fulfilled the most important mission of his life. On full moon nights, Marcus used to sit on the porch of the stone house, watching the silver fields extending to the horizon, with Ranger lying beside him. It was a simple routine, but one that brought deep satisfaction that he thought he had lost forever. "We made it, buddy," Marcus would say to the dog on these occasions. "James Miller would be proud of what we did with his gift." Ranger always responded with a small, confirming bark, as if he perfectly understood the meaning of those words. 2 years after discovering the treasure, Marcus decided to write his own letter to a future successor. Not because he planned to leave the property, on the contrary, he had found his definitive home there, but because he understood James Miller's wisdom in ensuring continuity for something so valuable. The letter began like this: "For whoever comes after me and knows how to value what really matters, my name is Marcus Rivera, and I received this land from James Miller's hands through an extraordinary dog named Ranger. If you're reading this, it means Ranger, or his descendants, chose you as he did me, and that you demonstrated the necessary qualities to care for this special inheritance. This property isn't just land, it's a refuge, a sanctuary, an opportunity to live in harmony with nature and yourself. James Miller preserved it for decades, and I had the privilege of continuing his work. Now, this responsibility can be yours. But remember, it's not property you possess, it's a mission you accept." Marcus stored the letter in a safe place, along with updated maps of the property and detailed instructions about its operation. Ranger watched the entire process with interest, as if he understood that this was part of the eternal cycle of preservation that James Miller had initiated. And so, in the frozen mountains of Montana, the story continued. A lost veteran had found not just a new home, but a new reason to exist. A loyal dog had fulfilled the mission left by his old owner and found a new family with whom to share his remaining years. And a special piece of land continued being cared for by someone who understood its true value, ensuring that springs remained clean, that native forests were preserved, and that the tradition of sustainable agriculture continued benefiting not only its guardian, but the entire surrounding community. Because sometimes the best treasures aren't those buried in the ground. They're those we discover when we finally learn to value what really matters, when we find the place where we belong, and when we understand that true wealth lies in the opportunity to care for something greater than ourselves. And Ranger, now 9 years old, with some white hairs on his muzzle, continued making his morning rounds through the fields, no longer looking for a successor for James Miller, but protecting the home he had helped create, where 2 survivors had finally found the peace and purpose they deserved. On cold winter mornings, when frost covered the fields like a crystal blanket, Marcus would drink his coffee on the porch, watching Ranger explore the surroundings with his usual curiosity. It was a sight he never tired of appreciating, that of a loyal companion who had transformed his life in ways he could never have imagined. "Thank you, buddy," Marcus would murmur on these occasions, "for everything." And Ranger, as always, responded with a soft bark that seemed to say, "It was my pleasure, friend. It was my pleasure."